Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jo Hoeksema. She's the Director of Government and Public Affairs for the Population Association of America and the Association of Population Centers. Since 2008, Mrs. Hoeksema has co-directed the Census Project Coalition. She's also a member of the Coalition for Health Funding Board of Directors and ad hoc group for Medical Research Steering Committee. Prior to a position with PAA and APC, Jo Hoeksema worked at the National Institute of Health for approximately 10 years. She holds a Master in Public Administration from George Washington University. Welcome, Jo.
Going to help me with my slides?
Yes.
Oh, good. Well, while the slides gear up, I just want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this important symposium. As someone who's been following and commenting on your nation's struggles, I really do share your enthusiasm for the return of the mandatory long form. Heidi invited me to participate in today's symposium to address a couple of issues that we're dealing with in the United States, those of us who are census stakeholders. Specifically, the debate around funding for the next decennial census in the United States, Census 2020, thank you, and the debate around the American Community Survey, which is the equivalent of our long form. She also asked me to address how census stakeholders are engaged in this debate. So where we are in the United States, Census 2020, we are ramping up in the United States. We are 4 years out. There are a number of field tests that the Census Bureau is conducting across the country, and they have more planned for next year, in which they are testing a number of innovations that the Census Bureau claims could not only modernize Census 2020, but also save the U.S. taxpayers as much as $5 billion over the life cycle of the census. Some of those innovations that they're testing include the use of government and commercial databases to update address lists and maps. They are testing internet response mode. They are also using adaptive design in their field collection activities, and also testing the use of administrative records to enumerate unresponsive households. So how does census stakeholders fit into all of this? We have the dubious challenge of defending all of these activities, particularly from a budgetary standpoint. The census budget, though, is unique among other federal agencies in the United States. The Census Bureau's budget ramps up through the middle of the decade and then ramps back down. Most federal agencies in the United States, their baseline funding hovers around a specific number. It may go up a little or down a little. So this is a real challenge for stakeholders because we are constantly in the process of educating lawmakers and their staffs about about how the Census Bureau budget flows and why the Census Bureau needs more money at critical points during the course of the decade. So as stakeholders, we work really hard to explain this cycle to lawmakers. And unfortunately, many U.S. Policymakers don't either understand why it's important that the Census Bureau budget ramps up and ramps back down, or they simply see these large increases years out before the decennial census as piggy banks, money that could be rated or used for other programs that have more immediate pressing needs. We also, as stakeholders, confront a fair amount of skepticism about the claims that the Bureau may make about the promises of technology or about the potential cost savings that these investments, particularly in the middle of the decade, could yield. Finally, a challenge that Census Bureau stakeholders in the United States face, particularly in dealing with Congress, is the bill that funds the Census Bureau, both in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate, is grouped with another of other federal agencies. This bill is called the Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill. And included in that bill are agencies, some of which I think will sound very familiar to you: the National Science Foundation, NASA, Department of Justice, which includes the FBI. And so when you have these kinds of competing funding priorities, sometimes, yes, data and the Census Bureau lose. In fact, just a few weeks ago, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee that funds the Census Bureau and all these other agencies I mentioned was quoted in an article saying that he will prioritize law enforcement and scientific research in his bill over the needs of the Census Bureau. We are also, as stakeholders, challenged, as we are on all the issues we advocate for, the overall challenging budget climate in the United States, the tight budgetary caps we're all operating under. With respect to the American Community Survey, I guess I just wanted to first make sure all of you are familiar with the American Community Survey. It is our census long form. It was established with congressional support in 2005, and it replaced our once-a-decade long form. This is worth repeating. It is the only source of comparable, consistent, timely, high-quality demographic and socioeconomic data for all U.S. communities. It is part of the constitutionally required decennial census program, and therefore it is a mandatory survey that approximately 3.5 million households in the United States receive annually. It guides billions of dollars of federal funding to states and localities, and it drives key investment and planning decisions made by government officials as well as business interests. So despite its obvious significance, it has its fair share of critics, particularly in the United States Congress. I would say their concerns are centered into three major areas. They're concerned about the respondent burden that we place upon individuals who receive this survey, the perceived intrusiveness of the survey, and its costs. And to sort of channel their concerns, they've taken several of these actions. The first being offering amendments to funding bills, like the one I described to you, to either undermine the mandatory status of the ACS or its funding, or they've introduced separate legislation to make the ACS voluntary, or they've held congressional hearings. I think we had a real wake-up call in the census advocacy community in 2012 when an amendment passed on the House floor to make not only the ACS voluntary, but then to defund it altogether. This was a real wake-up call for all of us who had thought it would never come to this. So how did we respond, we being census stakeholders? We've really responded through our activities through the work of the Census Project, which I co-direct. The Census Project is a broad-based, nonpartisan, diverse network that includes the interests of business, the business sector, labor, civil rights, scientific research, housing, and human services groups. Together, we all support not only the work of the preparations for the decennial census, but also a robust mandatory ACS. How do we work? Well, we work to develop cogent, compelling arguments that appeal to a broad political audience. We emphasize the applied uses of the ACS and census data in particular to demonstrate how the data benefit essential services and programs at the state and local level. We conduct face-to-face meetings with members of Congress and their staff, as well as administration officials, to communicate our interests. And whenever possible, we bring stakeholders to meetings with members and staff that have the most relevance to that particular member's or office's committee assignments or legislative priorities. We reach out to the grassroots through our member organizations by developing materials that they can then use to develop their own messages when they speak to policymakers. We also engage the media. We provide technical assistance to the media, media releases, and op-eds. So we also hold regular conference calls to educate the media about our interests. We also develop one-page fact sheets, updates, and blog posts. Finally, for purposes of Congress, we organize sign-on letters that our organizations will sign to communicate our positions on funding and the importance of the ACS to Congress. And this is what Congress really appreciates: coordinated messages coming from one coalition that represents a broad number of interests. We think our activities have paid off. I've listed here a number of our smaller victories, but they are worth listing. With respect to the ACS, we've seen amendments that have been, or language that's been removed from bills that would make the ACS voluntary. We've seen our funding levels restored in some cases for the decennial census. There's also been a lot of work behind the scenes. We've seen members have withdrawn amendments they were originally going to offer that would either divert funding away from the Census Bureau or affect the ACS. We've also had more members of Congress sign letters of support to the appropriations committees in support of funding the Census Bureau over the last 2 years. 3 years ago, we didn't have any of these letters, and these are very important to the process. It's a little bit internal, but trust me, it's good news. So should we declare victory? No, not yet, and really not ever. We know that we need to sustain our role in the dialogue if we are to not only ensure that the decennial census continues to receive funding in the future, but also to ensure that we never have to experience what you've gone through and see our American Community Survey become a voluntary survey. So thank you.